wherever you are. Any NAV fan who has joined in today, very welcome to this next NAV Skills webinar. My name is Luc van Vught. I'm hosting this webinar today, and well, we'll be looking at We'll be looking at the new development environment of NAV, or actually we're looking at the first views on it. We found a panel today who will be helping us getting a clearer view on what's to come. And today we will start with Daniel Rimmelzwaan, one of my MVP fellows, who will start with a short demo. And after that, we'll have a discussion on what to expect next, or how to handle this in everyday practice, which will be not so far in the future for many of us. So welcome to Daniel and Eric, of course. Any questions? I will be asking you to fill in it to the chat box, and I will be moderating them, helping the presenters to get their job done and get the questions answered later on. At the end, of course, when questions are more than we can answer in this hour, we'll record them and then maybe get back onto that later. And of course, this whole thing will be recorded and will be published shortly after this, so anybody wanting to review the whole thing, showing it to their colleagues, feel free to do so. So I want to welcome Daniel first. Please, Rick, our moderator, also providing us access to Daniel. Go ahead.
All right, it says it's showing here. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes, we can see it.
All right, cool. So my name was wrong on that slide. I'm not Eric Ernst. I'm Daniel Rimmelzwaan. I'm in Arizona, so it's 8 o'clock in the morning. I just had my coffee. Welcome to this webinar. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you around the Azure VM that has the DevTools preview. I'm not going to go into how you get that set up. You need an Azure account, and then you find the AL VM and install it, and then you just start it, and you can RDP in. So I'm actually RDPing into the Azure VM, and when I open this, I get this, what do you call this, help file, where you can read about the basic setup. They've given us a lot of information about this, so you can really read about, you know, how it's all set up, where to find references. They have a bunch of links over here to get you the information that you need to get it started. And I would recommend, you know, you read a bunch of this to get familiar with all the pieces. So on this VM, there is a folder on the C drive that's called Demo, and inside the Demo there's a folder called New Developer Experience, and in there is a folder called Samples. And here is a list of samples that Microsoft has given us, and I'll just be walking around showing you around some of these things. So when you have Visual Studio Code installed, it also installs a file extension, or what do you call that? You right-click on it, and then you can say Open with Code. What that means is it recognizes it as a Visual Studio Code folder, and when you open it, you see all the files. So I want to just go over how this works. So inside of this folder, there's the files of the extensions, and there's a couple of things that you need to know. One is the launch JSON, and the other one is the app JSON. The launch JSON is I think this is the manifest, or is that the app JSON? I always get them confused. It's not loading.
The app JSON is the manifest, the project
manifest,
file.
right? Yeah. Yeah, and so this is more or less the configuration file. So you have the package, file name, the project root, the server instance, and the tenant. So in a multi-tenant environment, you can specify which tenant to install this on. So this is what like the target service tier, and then the app JSON is the information about the app itself. Yeah, that's right. This is more the manifest. One thing that is important is the resources. As you can see, my cursor turns black, so I can hardly see it. I don't know where it is, so bear with me. Here it is. So the resource files are also in the demo folder. Here it is, resources. And this is the Navix file, and I was confused as to how this works. Eric is going to go into that later, but the way that I understand it is the Navix file is not so much the package file for the extension itself, but it's the base system on top of which the extension is built. So you can see here in the Navix file, or in the app JSON, there's a locale US, there's a version 10. You can find that back in the Navix file US and version 10. And that's what that reference is for. So this is an extension that builds on top of that resource. So the simplest example is the Hello World AL. And this is a simple code unit that shows a message. This is really slow. It was much faster this morning. Here we go. So this is a simple code unit. And this is, by the way, some of the code help that you will find in this help file. Over here it says building your own AL project. There's some snippets that you can use in this code unit. Is a snippet that you can start out with. So this is basically the code unit. You can see it uses the curly brackets, and then it has triggers on run in table objects. There are other triggers to table triggers, and then you can add procedures and things like that. So this is like the simplest extension that we can have, just a Hello World code unit. If we go into other like the customer card, where is it? Simple customer card, opening code. You can see that one of the so again, there's a launch JSON and an app JSON, so every extension has those files. Then you can see in the customer list extension, you can see that this is a page extension object. So it's a different type of object that is an extension on top of the page. So it gets a number and a list, so number 70,022, customer list extension. It extends the customer list. So extends is a reference to the standard object, and then customer list is the name of that object. You can see that there is still a number, an object number. I'm not sure what's going to happen with that, but I'm sure that everybody wants to get rid of object numbers altogether. So page extension, there's a piece that covers the layout, so that's where you would make changes to the way that the page looks. This is a positioning of your control, field names and things like that. You can actually manipulate the way that that looks. And then you have a container for actions. Add first is where you want that action to be, and then you have the actual action itself. I'm not going to go into all the details simply because I don't know all the details. I'm just also just getting started with this. But you can see a bunch of these things are recognizable, right? So you have your run object equals page simple customer card. And if you can see, there's a new customer card over here. That's a page. It has a number and a name. It's a page type with a source table. Those are all properties that we're familiar with. And it has a layout with an area and a group and then these 3 fields. So when you would install this and provide access to the system in there, you know, it'll show the simple customer card. One other thing that I wanted to show you, because this to me it gets overwhelming really fast, and so I was browsing around yesterday about in these folders, and one of the folders over here is the AL folder, and I've noticed that there are a few standard objects in there, so you can actually see some standard objects in Visual Studio Code to kind of give you an idea of what this looks like. So they took the standard customer card or customer table and created it into an AL object so that you can kind of browse around and see where the properties are and where the fields are. So you have your caption, your data caption fields, your drill down page, lookup page ID, permissions. The things that are interesting to me are how do they do fields and triggers. I lost my cursor. Where is it? Oh, there it is. So, you know, you have your onValidate trigger. Interesting that the word trigger and the word begin that belongs to the trigger is lowercase, and then the code itself is uppercase. So you can notice right away that the code within those triggers is very simple AL code. So we're still going to be programming using regular AL for now, at least. I don't know if there are plans to make this different, but we've been talking amongst ourselves about, you know, what this really means. Is this a new language, or is this just a different way of containing language? And that's really what it is. This is just simple AL code in a different container, and what we need to do is figure out how the container works. And so that's why it's really useful to have you know, some of these standard objects. And I'm sure that by the time that we have the actual product in Visual Studio Code, there will be a way to get standard objects into an AL file. There might even be a better designer that it's more visual, that you're not just typing stuff, but this is what that looks like. So fields, let's see if I can go down to the keys. Come on, guys. Still fields. Here we have the keys. So that's what that looks like. You know, the keyword key with the fields in there. I'll just go into the code itself. So you have the table triggers here on delete. Modify. Just want to show you a function on rename. Where is it? Oh, those were the variables. Right, so with var over here, and you have the variables, and then we have the procedures. There's something new in here called scope extension. I'm not sure what that means. Some procedures have it, some procedures don't. You can see the scope of the regular procedure. So this is a local, this is a global. Anyway, that's what that looks like. I'll also quickly go into a page object. Open with code. Same thing, right? So you have your page, you have the number, you have the name, some global properties over here, and then we go into the layout. I'm sure that there's an action menu somewhere. So this is really useful because you have a reference point, you have the the customer list in NAV itself, you can see different elements, and you can kind of figure out where that is. And so this reminded me very much like the first days of page objects as opposed to form objects, where you're like, where the heck is everything? Right now it's pretty difficult to find stuff. I'm sure that over time Microsoft will give us better tools to better find things, and because this is in Visual Studio Code, there might actually be companies out there that will build extensions on top of Visual Studio Code to do these designers, because that's really what it is. Visual Studio Code itself has extensions, so the AL language is an extension of Visual Studio Code itself. And so there's already extensions for C#, for PowerShell, for all these other types of development that you can load into Visual Studio Code. And so it's kind of open source, and it's a free tool, and so there's lots of people building really interesting things. And I'm totally expecting a lot of people and companies to be adding interesting NAV stuff for us to play with.
Sorry, just to make a quick comment.
Sure.
This is not a free tool. Visual Studio Code is a free tool, but the AL extension for Visual Studio is covered by the NAV license. So it's not a open source tool per se. This is a licensed tool that uses a open source environment.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point, because I've looked around. I had looked around for a PHP tool, and one of them was free, and the other one was not free. So certain extensions are not free; I have to pay for them, and I'm sure that there's varying degrees of openness as to how the tools work inside, and what kind of access you have to those. So good point, Eric. That's a good point. Okay, so this is the Hello World sample that has been on GitHub. This is actually a code unit that I created myself just to see if I could do it. It's really a copy of the other Hello World, and you know, I just added the different message to it. I can't believe how slow this is. Wow. Okay, so the Hello World app has a customer card extension with an action, and what I wanted to show you is how to add an action to it. So here we go. So let's say, hey there. Run object. So it has a telesense, and if you look, let's see, there is a thing called problems. And when you see the problems down here, it keeps track of what you're doing. So this is real time. So when I want to program something, it'll tell me, you know, what is wrong with it. Code unit. And as you can see, it already shows up, right? So here in the bottom, there's my simple message code unit. And I'm just copying from the action up top here, so I'm not doing anything special. We're on page on rack equals true. Let's do promoted category equals, and you know, it'll tell you the actual values that you can use. So I'm just going to use the same values, and now I get this other message down here. The property promoted category can only be set if the property promoted is set to true. So let's put that to true. good for me. So I added an action on top of the other one, and let's compile it. So all you do is F5, and that compiles and builds the objects into the extension. It uses the app JSON and the launch JSON to figure out where that goes. So down here you can see where it goes: localhost, Navision main, dev app tenant equals default. That's all out of that launch JSON and app JSON file. So let's see if it works. All right, so here's our show greeting. That was the Hello World example with a random language. Pig Latin. Hey, that's nice. That's the one I added. And then here's our Hey there, Mr. Mike Nash. So, you know, this is really how easy it is to create an extension. So if anyone has done an extension yourself, you know how difficult it is, right? You have to get the base objects, then you have the modified objects, you have to get the data file, the delta files, you have to create the manifest file, you have to create all these things and then publish it and then install it. And, you know, it's very cumbersome. There's a lot of work to it. And so what they have established by doing it like this is where you have a project in a development environment. You can totally focus on developing that extension. Then you hit F5, and that builds and installs the whole thing directly into the service tier itself. Now, this is all work in progress, right? So there are many things that are still not right, many things that are incomplete. And if you're inclined to work with this and to find things and to report on issues, there's actually a project, Microsoft AL, on GitHub, and there's a thing called issues, and in there you can actually post new issues. And so this is where Microsoft is tracking issues on the AL extension. So I would say get yourself an Azure VM, put AL in there, start working with Visual Studio Code, play around with it, add things, and you know, post them in here. And I'm sure that as we're all working with this, we'll start putting questions on iBuso and things like that. So this is all public. You can start playing around with it. This is really it. What I wanted to show you. It's not a lot. I didn't go deep in there. You can also create an event or publish an event. You can subscribe to an event already. I don't know how it works yet, but you know, you can get quite fancy already, and they're working on this. So this was released, I think, earlier this month or late last month, and you know, I'm sure that this was even a few iterations behind where they are today. So I'm sure that they are already fixing a bunch of the issues on GitHub. And I just wanted to open it up for questions from here. So thanks for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. While I'm getting my things done here, a first question to you, Daniel. You got this working on the VM. How much time did it take you to get up and working?
It took me maybe 10-15 minutes.
Yes.
So I have to say I already had an Azure account, and I had already. So I'm new at a lot of these. So what I'm showing you here is pretty much all I know. So it was you know, over or intimidating a little bit. But when I started working with it, it's really very intuitive. So once you're in the Azure portal, you go to the VM or the virtual machines area, and then you just type in Dynamics NAV, AL. It'll show up in there. And also there is an article on the NAV team blog. I should have shown you that. So if you go to the NAV team blog on MSDN, there's an article in there that walks you through all the steps of setting up the Azure account. But once you find it, it's really a matter of hitting the start button, and it's provisioned, and then you just use the IP address that's shown in there in your regular remote desktop program, and it connects right away. One thing I wanted to mention is that when you stop it, to stop the counter, because it's not free, and you don't want to have this run without using it, right? So it's very cheap to run it, but when you run it for a whole month, it adds up real quick. So you want to stop the VM in Azure, and when you stop it, it throws away the IP address. So when you restart it, the IP address of the VM changes, at least for me. So that's the caveat.
I've got a couple of questions, guys. But first, Erik Hougaard, there was a part, some, let's say, extended deep dive part you had been into. Would you like to pay attention to that first?
No, let's jump right into the questions.
Okay.
And Luke, I'd like to interrupt you just for a moment. This is Andrew. Can you just minimize your Skype window, please?
Yes, I will. Sorry, I wasn't aware of that. Yeah, sure. Thanks for saying so. First question here from Imran. This is for the next version of NAV. This is a preview, of course. That's the answer of Rick, by the way, already. What can we expect as developers in general? How fast are we going to be confronted, if I may put it that way, with VS Code instead of, let's say, our old-fashioned development environment?
That depends on your target. If your target is Dynamics 365, this is coming like a steam train. This is coming fast, because one of the so if you heard Microsoft talk about it, they often refer to this as the extensions version 2. And this is basically exactly what it is. All extensions were basically a zip file with Delta files, and then you had a lot of source manipulation going on the service tier. These new object types, the page extension, the table extension objects, which are modifier objects, they can be applied at runtime without doing crazy source manipulation, without doing anything, but just install it, and then it'll work. So that is so much easier, and I'm doing a lot of quotation marks in the air right now, easier for Microsoft to handle the whole business of running the back end of Dynamics 365 instead of having source manipulation going on at a large scale multi-tenant backend. So if you're on Dynamics 365, this will come fast. If you're on standard NAV, there's still, as you can see, there's still a lot of things that's not there. There's no report designer. There's no, some of the other object types are not supported yet. And if we look at Navision's, NAV's, PC Plus, whatever history, the whole history of the product, reporting has always been a sore point. So my guess is that we're stuck with Seaside a bit longer. But then again, they're working very hard on this and progressing quite fast. So just hoping.
Thank you very much. If I more or less continue on this with comparable questions, this VS Code thing, of course, it's a preview, a first version. Looking back from 2016, where we were able to create extensions already. A logical first question from Jose is, would we be able to use this VS Code thing? I'm sorry for some distortion here. There's apparently some training going on in the sky here. But would we be able to use this VS Code thing for extensions on 2016 also?
No. 2016 only supports extensions version 1. So the output extension file does not work in 2016.
Clear. And when we have this extension, it's actually a question from Rasmus, but let me translate it more or less. Would we be able to, or what is Microsoft thinking of tools that would be allow us to convert 2016 extensions?
So there will be a so let's step one step back. So the .al format, if you look at it from far away, it can almost be mistaken for the .txt format. But the .txt format has a lot of issues, and basically you can look at the .al format as fixing all those issues. One of the most, the two prominent problems with the .txt format is the dependency on code page and the crazy, some stuff are controlled by indentation and other stuff are controlled by curly brackets. So that makes it really editor hard to work in with just an editor. So the new format, as Danny just said, is just another container format for the same code as we know, but there will be an exporter. So you can from C side export your old objects into .al format and then work on them in Visual Studio Code. There might be the need for some slight manual fixing of a few things when you do this, simply because that there are some things with option fields and value fields that needs to be specified more correctly in the new one than was than in the old one. But there will be a converter that will allow you to export objects into AL format, existing objects. Yeah.
Maybe more regarding the can I use VS Code for NAV 2016. For me, I've been using it for NAV 2016 just to get used to the VS Code thing in terms of upgrading. I've been solving conflicts, for instance, using VS Code, and it actually kind of makes sense because VS Code behaves like a code designer. It's not just when you open just a text file, it behaves like a code designer. So it's going to help you with this IntelliSense thing as much as it can as possible. And that is kind of interesting when you're actually merging and doing stuff like that. And obviously you can do PowerShell in it as well. So in terms from getting used to VS Code, it's definitely interesting to just use it as being your text editor.
Yeah, I wanted to say the same thing. I've done it myself too, where so I didn't show you in the demo, but you can actually have 2 and even 3 editors open in the same time within the same context at the same time. So you can actually have the folder with your conflicts and your text files open. Then you click on the left side, you click on your conflict file, and on the right side you click on the text file. You can edit them at the same time, so you can go through your conflict file as you're manipulating your target text file at the same time. And you know, it's not an official code editor, but it's really cool to use it and get used to the way that it works. So yeah, I wanted to mention that too.
I've got a question from Martin Holm. Is there a time frame for when we will be able to install AL extensions locally and use local databases? I guess this is meant in the sense of using this for AL development in general.
As far as I know, yes, you will be able to do that in the future. Now, I have been trying to get this cloud environment, so I've got my own VM and this demo on it, and I've been trying to get that on a local machine, and that is actually already possible. The only thing that you need is the installs from the DVD, because you actually need a new runtime version of NAV. And then you need the extension and install it. I used Freddy's install scripts that are also available on the VM, and you can get your way actually through that to already install it on a local environment.
Yeah, just be aware that the NAV version in this virtual machine is newer than 2017.
Yes,
so
yes.
If you have a 2017 installation on your machine, you might completely ruin that by trying to copy pieces from this one to your local machine.
The extension will not work on a current version of NAV 2017. It just won't, because you need like new binaries. You need a new server.exe, let's say.
Clear. Do you have any ideas on when the VS Code will be the replacement for the FinSQL, our old environment, if I may put it this way? Any hints on it?
I have not heard any time frame. They won't even, so we are all MVPs, right? And so we were at NAV Tech Days, and I talked to a bunch of Microsoft people, and nobody will even say anything about the official timeline, even off the record. So I honestly don't know. I would hope that they are sooner rather than later, but I don't know if there's a time frame. I think for Dynamics 365, it'll come faster than for on-premise NAV.
The old saying from the guys who made Doom and Quake, and so, when it's done.
Yeah.
I think that's the only right answer.
Yeah.
So, next question. If we want to publish this to customers, how do we publish it? Do we publish it the way you showed it, Daniel? I guess not. But how do we get such an extension that we created in a live environment of a customer?
Right now you don't, because this is just a preview. So this is like a beta version. It is not intended to go live. But by the time that it goes live, what I imagine is that we'll have something similar to the Navix file or some sort of installer that with a deployment instructions, how that's going to work. I have a feeling that that is going to be a lot easier than it is today. But really, what it is today is you put your Navix file in there, you publish and you install it. So that part is really the easy part of building an extension. And by the time that this comes into production, I'm sure that they have the tooling that comes with it, with PowerShell commands and that sort of thing. So.
Yeah, from the technical aspect, that part hasn't really changed. So if the extension still goes into the same place than the version 1 extension goes into, so you can still deploy it with PowerShell. There's the exact same procedure. If you're on Dynamics 365, the only way to get something to a customer is, of course, to app source.
Right.
A detailed question or detailing question is this AL thing. I guess part of the story answered it already, but Imran is asking, apparently not fully clear. Is this AL type thing only going to be used to create extensions and nothing more?
Everything is an extension now, so that's perhaps it's a good question, because you used to be able to see site go in, you add a field to a standard table, you change the standard page. Those modifications are gone. You cannot do that anymore. So if you want to modify one of the existing objects inside NAV, you create a page extension object or a table extension object with your modification in. So everything is now an extension. So that's a very different approach from what we've been used to, and there are a few limitations that some of the modifications that you used to be able to do on existing objects, you cannot do those anymore. You cannot change the standard NAV code. You can replace the object with a version, your version, where you do something else, or you can make new actions and remove fields or move fields around and stuff like that. But the amount of freedom that you have today will be less, and this is the price for being able to handle modifications without code merging and all that stuff.
Clear, thank you. Of course, we have this AL thing, and is it going to be like this, or is it going to be more like .NET? So people are more used to, or getting easier to jump from .NET into AL?
As far as I know, this is still open for discussion. There are very good reasons to stay as close as possible to AL or CAL that we know it as now. And there are obviously also good reasons to go as close to C# or whatever. But I think, me personally, I think it's a very good idea to stay as close as possible to AL to be able to convert our developers that are used to AL as fast as possible.
But I think it's important to repeat that this is not a new language. This is purely a new container format for the existing language. The only thing new is the extension objects. And look at the amount of people who know AL, look at the amount of code in the world that programmed in AL. AL is a very good language for what it does. It's designed specifically to do ERP applications. And if you look at the amount of C# code you need to do in order for replicating some of the features you have in AL, then it's not obvious that, hey, .NET is the answer to everything. AL might be exotic on a global scale in the world, but it's a very good language for what it does, and I'm convinced that it will stay the way it is for years to come.
Yeah, and I also want to repeat that in the demo folder there's an AL folder, and there are some standard objects in there. So there's a card page, there's a list page, there's a table, and there's a code unit. And so if you open those in Visual Studio Code, you can see that the container itself, so there's, you know, an area called trigger, and then it says on run, and then it has a curly brace. But inside the curly brace, it's just regular CAL code. So, you know, you'll still be programming using the same language. The language is not going to change. There's been a big discussion, and, you know, some people want to go. I'm one of the people that I think that it would be beneficial to have a deeper integration. But, you know, then you have the question of, well, if we have a new language, then we have to translate everything. and that's just too much work at this point. And it's easier. Why would you fix AL when it does what it needs to do very well? And it's there anyway. So the language itself, the programming itself, will still be the same.
And
maybe. Sorry.
Yeah. No, and any interesting point is that AL is basically Pascal in some form, and one thing that the new .al file container format did was actually return the begin-end statements for triggers that is exactly like a Pascal format. The variables are in the var section, that's just Pascal. So from a lot of perspectives, this format is actually getting us back and closer to the original language layout of Pascal.
I've got a question from Dimitri. Extensions will be built with AL. Will they only work with the web version of the client, or will it also be working on an on-premise version?
Any client.
It doesn't matter. So a page object is the page object, and whether you see it in the Windows client or in the tablet client or the web client, it's the same object. So you extend the page, and it will be rendered in, whichever client you're using. So.
There was a question from Marcus actually wondering what do you do with your development license? Do you need to import that in the VS Code, or is there something not yet set for it? Or
at this point, it's locked, but basically you will have a development license that's running on the NAV instance that you're running.
Yeah, it will only be checked when you publish it, right? So
well, right now,
building the extension.
Sorry.
Yeah, the moment that you're building the extension, where it will actually be imported in the service or in the database.
Yeah, but right now, if you try to create an object outside the 77 range, you'll get an error saying that you do not have license to that number. So there's some in the preview hard-coded things, and I guess there will be a more formal way of handling that in the future.
Darren question from Amran. Will we be able to use C# code within AL code?
Yeah and no. If you read the release things about the release notes on this, it says that .NET variables are not available. The problem is that with the current incarnation of .NET, all the .NET capabilities we have in 2016, 2017, they actually present a challenge for Microsoft in the Dynamics 365 environment, because we can, when we have access to .NET, we can escape the sandbox. We can do a lot of interesting stuff. We can access other sessions. We can do all sorts of crazy hacks from .NET. And Microsoft do not want us through .NET to be able to bring down the Dynamics 365 backend, of course. So they are working on figuring out what should they do with .NET. Should they create wrappers for what's allowed, whitelist, blacklist? They need to handle .NET. And there will be a story on that at some point. What we will not see, I'm pretty sure, is that you can intertwine languages. So it's either that there will be a NavX extension file that basically is a wrapper for the .NET classes that you are allowed to use, or some other constructions that looks a bit like what we have today with the .NET variables in 2017. But .NET has become a challenge simply because you can do so much, and they really don't want a .NET extension to bring down the Dynamics 365 backend. Oops.
Yeah, thanks. I hear somebody typing, so maybe could mute his microphone. A question from Rasmus. As you showed us, Daniel, you actually create your extension by coding in VS Code and then build it, and it will be published or inserted through the service tier into the database. Is there something about permissions or your roles that you need to have to be able to do that? So to be able to publish this extension while you're developing it, do you have to have specific rights?
I'm sure that you do. What those rights are, I'm not sure. But of course, you need the permission to make those changes. And then, you know, when you deploy it, you will only have the extension package itself. And then about permissions and those types of things, so the permission sets for your extension itself, of course, will have to be part of the package. And just like today, when you create an extension, you export the permission sets, you export your web services, you add your other packages, and I'm sure that by the time that VS Code comes out for production, we'll have a way to include those files within the extension itself as well. What that looks like, nobody knows yet, of course. But yeah, you need to have the permissions to access the app database in order to make those changes. But what the permission is specifically, I'm not sure. Probably super level.
So the launch JSON that Daniel showed is the one that specifies how you connect to the service tier from the development environment, and by default it's just like with PowerShell that your current Windows credentials are used to identify you and see if you have access to that service tier. I don't know if people noticed when Daniel started the press F5 to deploy that VS Code actually turned into to debug mode. So there were a window with stack trays and variables and stuff like that. That is because that the AL extension, and I know the word extension gets confusing, but the extension that extends VS Code to extend NAV through extensions, that extension uses the debug part of VS Code to deploy, and of course at some point VS Code will also become the debugger. So you basically be able to debug exactly directly from VS Code. So you press F5 and you're in the debugger, just like in the big Visual Studio environment. Luke?
Eric, maybe a question for you also. I saw that you blogged on using Sublime as an editor. I got a question from it, but apparently I deleted it just now, so I don't know the name of the guy who posed the question, but would we be able to use other editors next to VS Code to do this?
So yeah, I played around with this. I'm a big Sublime text user, and one of the things about this piece is that you get the compiler as just the compiler, so why not be able to use it from somewhere else? So what I did was that I went into the belly of the beast and extracted the compiler and figured out how that worked, and created a a build system for Sublime, so I could just use the compiler from within Sublime. Another thing I did was that I looked at the source highlighting, and there is an editor called TextMate, which is not very popular now, but it did introduce a fairly good format for source highlighting. So Sublime Text uses actually TextMate format for source highlighting, and the same thing does VS Code. So I could simply copy the VS Code AL syntax definition files into Sublime, and I now have syntax highlighting in Sublime. I'm looking into the figure out if I can do a deployment from Sublime. I'm looking into see if I can connect. So one of the big piece in this extension is actually the language service. So part of this extension is built on what is known as Roslyn, which is a new C# compiler. And one of the amazing things in Roslyn is the way that you get it. It basically compiles everything all the time, and you can use the output information to do true intelligence. So the compiler, the editor actually knows more about the code than just what words start with A. If you type the letter A, it knows the content. So after an equal sign, it knows what types are valid after that equal sign. And the AL extension also uses the same constructs with a language server. So as soon as you start up VS Code, and the instance of the language server is started, and that's what's providing you with this deep intelligence information. That has been created for Sublime also, and I was looking into see could I perhaps do another hack to activate that, but that will take a lot of work. So maybe sometime next year. Anyway, but another more relevant output of this is that if you're suddenly in a automated DevOps built environment, we got the compiler as a standalone piece now. So of course we want to be able to compile code just from a command line, from a PowerShell script, from a team services build pipeline, all that. And that's also in my blog that, hey, this is how the compiler works as a standalone piece, which is quite interesting.
So we're at the verge of the hour, getting close to closing down. I still have a number of questions left. I'll pick out a last one. Will previews on Azure be updated with every new version?
Well, I heard of a I heard of a January release, so I think we can expect that there will be some new version in January. So yeah.
So that we're going to close here for today. Of course, would like to thank the panel, and yes, sorry for you, Daniel, that we have only Erics on the list, but apparently, well, I think I introduced you very well as Daniel, so everybody knows it was Daniel and not Eric Ernst. I think the letters were too few today, but thank you very much, all three of you guys. Thank you for everybody to attend, and of course, as said before, we will have this recording released on YouTube, so feel free to share it with others. So, well, 5 o'clock here in Europe, 12 o'clock in Canada, I think. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a nice evening or the rest of a longer day, and hope to have you around in one of our next webinars in the future. Thank you very much.
And 8 p.m. in Dubai.
Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.